Georgia, 1858. The road into Carter Plantation cut through miles of cotton, white and endless under the late morning sun. From a distance, the place looked almost peaceful. Rows of cotton stretching toward the horizon, a wide white house standing above the fields, tall trees barely moving in the heat. But peace is often just what power looks like from far enough away. Down below, in those rows, enslaved men and women bent at the waist beneath the sun, hands moving fast, fingers raw from the burrs, sacks dragging behind them through the dirt. The overseer rode slowly along the edge of the field, saying almost nothing, because on plantations like this, silence could control people just as well as shouting. And above all of it, watching from the hill, was Jonathan Carter. Carter was not known as a loud man. He did not rage in public. He did not drink himself into spectacle. He did not need to. His reputation came from something else. The cold patience with which he looked at other human beings, as if each one might contain a mechanism he had not yet understood. His study inside the main house was filled with books, medicine, anatomy, natural philosophy, case studies from Europe, sketches of bodies, notes in the margins, pages marked and folded and revisited until the paper softened at the edges. Some men collected horses, some collected silver. Jonathan Carter collected explanations. And whenever the world presented him with something strange, something that resisted easy naming, his curiosity sharpened into fixation. That was the state of his mind on the morning the trader's wagon arrived. It came slowly, pulled by two exhausted horses, wood groaning under the weight, iron rims grinding dust into the road. Everyone on the plantation knew that sound. The workers in the fields lifted their heads for only a second before lowering them again. No one needed to ask what it meant. A wagon like that brought change, and on plantations, change almost never arrived with mercy. The overseer moved first, riding down toward the yard as the wagon rolled into the clearing near the big house. The trader climbed down, boots hitting the dust, and began the familiar ritual. Chains loosened, bodies arranged, people lined up in a row, facing a future none of them had chosen. Jonathan Carter stepped out onto the porch a moment later. He did not hurry. He descended the steps with a measured calm, one hand behind his back, eyes moving from person to person as the trader recited the usual inventory: age, strength, field capacity, health. The language of sale was always the same, a grammar designed to erase the human being standing inside it. Carter listened without much interest at first. One man fit for timber work, a woman accustomed to house labor, a younger boy strong enough for field training within the year. Usual bodies, options, usual lies. Then, halfway down the line, his attention stopped. There was a young person standing near the center, perhaps 17, maybe younger, slender, still in the way growing bodies sometimes are, caught between strength and softness. The face was fine-boned, the posture alert but composed, the expression neither submissive nor defiant, just watchful. And there was something else, something Carter noticed immediately, and did not yet have language for. The body resisted instant classification, not in some theatrical way, not as a spectacle, but in a quieter, more unsettling way. The kind of uncertainty that makes people look twice, then look away, because they are embarrassed by what they cannot resolve. The trader saw Carter's eyes stop and stepped forward. "That one is called Abigail," he said. Carter kept looking. "Abigail," he repeated. The name itself seemed to fix one thing, while the body unsettled another. Abigail did not drop her gaze at once. That alone was unusual. Not insolent, just calm. A calm that suggested not ignorance of danger, but familiarity with it. The trader cleared his throat. "There is something unusual about this one, sir." Carter turned his head slightly. "What do you mean?" The trader hesitated, not from conscience, but from calculation. Men who sold enslaved people knew when information raised a price, and when it frightened buyers away. "Doctors examined the body some years ago," he said at last. "Said the child was born with both male and female traits. I've heard the word used for such cases, hermaphrodite." The overseer frowned instantly. The word sounded foreign in the open Georgia heat, too medical for the yard, too strange for the ordinary brutality of plantation commerce. But Jonathan Carter did not recoil. He did not laugh. He did not cross himself. Something far more dangerous happened. He became interested. "Both traits?" Carter said quietly. "Yes, sir." "And no physician settled the matter?" "They argued," the trader replied. "Some said one thing, some said another. No one agreed for long." Carter stepped closer. Now he was not looking as a planter. He was looking as a man who believed the world had just placed a locked door in front of him. And Jonathan Carter had never been able to leave locked doors alone. He studied Abigail's shoulders, hands, face, the set of the jaw, the line of the neck, the stillness with which this scrutiny was being endured. Then he asked, not the trader, but Abigail, "How old are you?" 17. The voice was low, clear, difficult to place, not because it was unnatural, but because Carter had already begun listening for classification more than meaning. "Can you read?" A small hesitation. "A little." The trader glanced sideways, surprised the answer had been given so plainly. Carter's eyes sharpened. "Who taught you?" "A preacher, at the place where I lived before." That answer changed something. A body that resisted categories was one thing. A mind that could answer carefully, observe itself, and speak without panic. That was something else entirely. Carter turned back to the trader. "I will purchase this one. Only that. No haggling over the others. No further inspection." The trader blinked. "Only this one, sir?" "For now." Money changed hands. The transaction was entered. The chain was removed from Abigail's wrists. And just like that, the decision was made. The wagon would go on. The others would be sold elsewhere, but Abigail would remain on Carter land. The Carter's trader's wagon rolled back toward the road. The overseer stepped nearer and lowered his voice. "Sir, are you certain?" Carter did not answer immediately. He was still watching the departing dust, as if thinking through a question only he could hear. Then he said, almost to himself, "Nature sometimes produces rare mysteries." He finally turned, and it would be foolish not to study them. That was the moment it began. Not with rage, not with violence, not even with desire. Not yet. It began with classification, with the conviction that another human being could be reduced to a problem, examined until solved. Abigail was led away toward the quarters at the far edge of the plantation, past the cotton fields, past the eyes of workers who had already begun to whisper, past the world of labor, into the world of notice. And on plantations, being noticed by a man like Jonathan Carter could be more dangerous than being hated. Because hatred burns hot and reveals itself. But obsession takes notes. He did not buy a worker that day. He bought a question. And before summer was over, that question would begin to change him. Morning came early on the Carter plantation. It always did. Before the sun fully rose, before the heat settled into the ground, before the sky turned from gray to pale gold, the bell rang. Not loud, not violent, just steady. A sound that did not need to threaten, because everyone already understood what followed it. Doors opened across the slave quarters, one by one. Figures stepped out into the cool air, shoulders heavy, bodies still carrying the weight of yesterday's labor. No one spoke much. There was no need. Routine had replaced conversation long ago. Cornmeal was eaten quickly, water passed from hand to hand, and then the slow walk toward the fields began again. Abigail moved with them. Her place had been decided without discussion. Field work. The most common assignment, the most exhausting, the most anonymous. In the rows of cotton, difference did not matter. Only speed did. Only output. Only survival. She bent forward like the others, fingers working through the plants, pulling soft fiber free while the sharp edges of the pods caught at her skin. The sack behind her dragged across the dirt, growing heavier with each hour. The sun climbed slowly, and with it, the silence deepened. But even in silence, attention can travel. By the second day, people had already begun to notice her. Not openly, not directly, but in the way eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary, in the way conversations stopped when she passed, in the way uncertainty moved quietly through a place where everything was usually defined. Whispers spread faster than sound. They always did. She's the one the master chose, not for the fields, for something else. No one said the word. No one needed to. On plantations, unusual attention from the master rarely meant anything good. Still, curiosity lived alongside fear, and curiosity, like hunger, finds its way through any system. That afternoon, during a brief rest beneath a wide oak tree, an older woman moved slowly toward Abigail and sat beside her. Her name was Ruth. Age had taken some of her strength, but not her presence. Among the enslaved, there were always a few people who became something more than workers. Quiet anchors. People others listened to, even when they spoke softly. Ruth studied Abigail for a moment, not with suspicion, but with care. "You are new here," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Her voice carried the same calm Carter had noticed, but here, in the shade, it felt different. Less observed, more human. Ruth nodded slowly. "This place," she said, "it can wear a person down." A small pause. "But people here, we try to look after one another, when we can." Abigail glanced toward the fields, where the overseer still circled at a distance. "I understand." Ruth followed her gaze, then looked back. "I have heard the whispers," she said quietly. Abigail did not react. "That is not new to me," she replied. Something in that answer made Ruth's expression soften. "Then you already know something most people take years to learn," she said. "What is that?" Ruth leaned back slightly against the tree. "That the world does not fear what is dangerous. It fears what it cannot explain." Abigail allowed the faintest hint of a smile. For the first time since arriving, she was not being studied. She was being spoken to. The rest ended quickly. It always did. And the rhythm of the field pulled them back into motion, row after row, hour after hour, until the sun began its slow descent. But as the light shifted, something else changed. The overseer approached, not loudly, not urgently, just directly. He stopped beside Abigail. "The master wants you at the house, after work." No explanation, no reason, just the message. Around them, movement slowed, almost imperceptibly, hands still working, but ears listening. Abigail nodded once. Yes, sir. The overseer turned away, and just like that, the shape of her day had changed. By the time the sun dipped low, the fields emptied slowly, workers carrying their sacks back toward the weighing station, shoulders aching, hands raw, and Abigail walked in a different direction, toward the house. The path was not long, but it felt separate. Every step pulled her further from the anonymity of the fields and closer to something undefined. The main house stood quiet, windows catching the last of the light. The overseer opened the door without speaking and led her inside. The air changed immediately, cooler, still. The wooden floors polished, walls lined with objects that served no purpose except display. Paintings, shelves, books, so many books. This was not the world of labor. This was the world of thought. And at its center, Jonathan Carter. He sat at his desk, surrounded by open pages, candlelight beginning to glow beside him even before night had fully arrived. He looked up slowly. "Come closer." Abigail stepped forward. Not too fast, not too slow. Measured. The way a person moves when they understand that every movement is being observed. Carter studied her in silence for several seconds, not casually, not socially, but with intent. The kind of attention that does not blink often enough. "You are adjusting to the work?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He leaned back slightly. "I have spent many years studying unusual conditions of the human body," he said. The words were calm, almost polite, but there was something underneath them, something that did not belong to conversation. "Your case," he continued, "interests me greatly." Abigail remained still. Carter reached for one of the books on his desk, turning it so she could see the page. The illustration showed a human figure, lines drawn across it, annotations in tight handwriting. Not a person, a diagram. "Physicians in Europe have recorded cases like yours," he said, "but rarely with the opportunity for close observation." His eyes lifted from the page, back to her. "Do you understand what makes you unusual?" Abigail answered carefully. "I know people say I am different." Carter nodded. "Different," he repeated. Then, softer. "Rare." That word lingered in the air longer than the others, not because of how it was spoken, but because of what it implied. Carter stood, walking slowly around the desk, closing the distance without urgency. "I intend to study this condition," he said, "to observe, to record, to understand." Each word placed deliberately, each word removing something without naming it. Abigail felt it, not as fear, not yet, but as a shift. "I only wish to work and live quietly," she said. Carter stopped. For a moment, he seemed to consider that answer. Then he gave a small, almost amused nod. "Yes," he said, "but quiet lives rarely advance knowledge." The room fell silent. Not empty silence, but the kind that forms when something has already been decided. Carter returned to his desk, reaching for a notebook, opening it, dipping his pen into ink. "You may go," he said. Just like that, dismissed. Abigail turned, walking back toward the door, past the shelves, past the desk, past the pages that had already begun to define her without asking who she was. Outside, the air felt different, cooler, but heavier, because something had changed. Inside that room, Jonathan Carter had not spoken to her as a person. He had begun something else. Back in his study, Carter wrote, "Subject acquired. Rare biological condition confirmed. Displays composure, intelligence, unusual self-awareness." The words moved quickly across the page, clean, precise, detached. Each sentence narrowing her, reducing her, organizing her into something that could be understood or controlled. That was the beginning of it. Not violence, not cruelty, not yet. Just observation. But on plantations like this, observation was never neutral, because the man who observed owned what he was looking at. And the moment he began to write, Abigail stopped being a presence in his world and became a subject in it. The summons came again, 2 days later. Not at sunset this time, but earlier, while the sun still burned high above the cotton rows. The overseer did not explain. He never did. The master wants you now. That was enough. Around Abigail, hands slowed again, just slightly. Eyes lifted, then dropped. Because by now, it was no longer curiosity alone. It was pattern. And patterns meant something. Abigail wiped the dust from her hands, set her sack aside, and began walking. The path to the house felt different in daylight. Less shadow, more exposure. No place for thoughts to hide. Inside, the air was already still. The study door stood open, and this time, Jonathan Carter was not seated. He stood beside a long wooden table, its surface covered in books, papers, and something new. Objects, carefully arranged, deliberately placed. Small glass jars, thin brass instruments, measuring tools, polished and precise. Not decoration, not curiosity alone, preparation. "Come closer," Carter said. Abigail stepped forward. Her eyes moved briefly across the table, taking in each object, not with fear, but with recognition. This was no longer just conversation. Carter followed her gaze. "These are instruments used for study," he said. "Accurate study." He picked up one of the tools, a slender device, its edges fine, its purpose exact. "Science requires measurement," he continued. "Without it, we are left with opinion." He set it down again, gently, then reached for his notebook. "Stand straight," he said. Abigail did, not obediently, but knowingly. "What is your height?" she answered. Carter measured. Arms, shoulders, hands. Each number written carefully. Each detail recorded as if it belonged to something that could be mapped. Abigail remained still, her breath steady, her eyes unfocused. Not from fear, but from distance. The kind of distance people learn when their bodies are no longer entirely their own. Carter stepped back after several moments, examining his notes. "Extraordinary," he murmured. Not to her, to the page. That difference mattered. Then, something shifted. He looked up again, not at her body, at her face. "At your previous place," he said, "you mentioned being examined." "Yes." "By whom?" "Traveling men. Some said they were doctors." "And what did they conclude?" Abigail paused. "They disagreed." Carter's pen stopped moving. "Disagreed how?" "Some said I should live as a man, others said as a woman." A small silence. "And what did they choose?" Abigail met his eyes, for the first time since entering the room. "They chose neither." Carter blinked, just once. That answer did not fit easily into his framework. "Neither," he repeated. "They only watched," she said quietly. Carter turned slightly, walking back toward the desk, but slower now, less certain. The tools on the table suddenly seemed incomplete. Measurement had limits. Numbers could not resolve contradiction. He sat down, opened the notebook again, but this time he did not write immediately. Instead, he asked something different. Do you consider yourself male or female? The question hung in the room, heavier than the instruments, heavier than the silence. Abigail did not rush. I consider myself, she said slowly, a person. The answer landed differently, not defiant, not emotional, just clear. Carter leaned back slightly. For the first time, his expression changed. Not fascination, not satisfaction, something closer to interruption. You avoid classification, he said. No, Abigail replied. I do not fit it. That distinction was not small. Carter picked up his pen again, but this time his writing slowed. Subject demonstrates, he began, then stopped. The word felt insufficient now. He crossed it out, tried again. Displays awareness beyond, stopped again. The page resisted him, or perhaps she did. You read, he said suddenly. Yes, that is unusual. So is being asked questions like this, Abigail replied. A pause. Carter looked up, and this time there was something else in his gaze. Not just curiosity, recognition. You are not like the others, he said. Abigail's voice remained calm. The others are not given the chance to speak. That answer did not belong to the body. It belonged to the mind. And that was new territory. Carter stood again, pacing slowly, not restless, thinking. For centuries, he said, almost to himself, scholars have tried to categorize the human body, to define it, to contain it. He stopped, turned back toward her. But you, he hesitated, you complicate that effort. Abigail tilted her head slightly. Perhaps the effort is the problem. Carter did not answer immediately, because something had shifted. He had expected a case, a specimen, a problem to solve. Instead, he was facing something that answered back, something that did not resist him with force, but with clarity. And clarity is far more difficult to control. That will be enough for today, he said finally. His voice was quieter now, less certain. Abigail nodded, turning toward the door. But before she left, Carter spoke again. Abigail, she stopped. You are aware that your condition is rare. Yes, and that it may be valuable to study. A small pause. Yes. Carter's voice lowered. Then you understand why I must continue this work. Abigail did not turn back. She said softly, that you are trying to understand. And then she left. Back in the quarters, the air felt warmer, more human, filled with quiet movement and low voices. Ruth noticed her immediately. You were called again, she said. Yes. Ruth studied her face. What does he want? Abigail sat down slowly. He says he wants knowledge. Ruth's expression tightened, just slightly. That word, she said, can change meaning, depending on who is speaking it. Abigail looked toward the distant house, its windows glowing faintly in the dark. He is not only studying my body anymore, she said. Ruth did not look surprised. No, she replied quietly. He has started listening to your mind. A longer pause. That is worse. Abigail turned slightly. Why? Ruth's voice dropped lower. Because a man who studies a body can stop when he is satisfied. But a man who becomes interested in a mind does not stop easily. Back inside the house, Jonathan Carter sat alone at his desk. The instruments lay untouched, the measurements complete, but the notebook remained open. He read the last line again. I consider myself a person. Simple words, but they did something no measurement had done. They resisted him, not with force, but with truth. He began writing again. Not numbers, not dimensions, but thoughts. Subject demonstrates independent reasoning, displays resistance to categorical definition, presents intellectual qualities inconsistent with... He stopped. The sentence would not finish, because the framework itself was beginning to break. For the first time, Jonathan Carter was not studying a mystery. He was encountering one, and the more he tried to define it, the more it refused to stay still. What he did not yet understand was that something had already changed, quietly, irreversibly. Because the moment a man begins to question his own system, he is no longer in control of it. And Abigail, whether she intended to or not, had just become that question. By the middle of summer, the rhythm of the Carter plantation had not changed, but something beneath it had. The bell still rang before sunrise, the fields still filled with bodies bent under heat. The overseer still rode his quiet circles. Everything looked the same, and yet attention had shifted. Not loudly, not openly, but in ways that people who lived under control always notice first. Abigail was no longer just another worker. She was the one who left the field, again and again and again, sometimes at sunset, sometimes before, sometimes without warning. The overseer no longer hesitated when calling her. The words had become routine. The master wants you. Nothing more. No explanation. Because by now, no one needed one. Eyes followed her each time she walked toward the house. Not with curiosity anymore, but with quiet understanding. Something was happening. And on plantations, something always meant danger. Inside the study, the change was even clearer. The room itself had begun to transform. What had once been a place of books had become something else. Not quite a laboratory, but moving toward it. The desk was no longer enough. Tables had been cleared, instruments arranged with precision, glass jars lined in rows, notes stacked, then restacked, then rewritten. Carter had begun reorganizing the room around Abigail, not consciously, but completely. And more than that, he had begun reorganizing his thoughts. The early pages of his journal remained, clean, clinical, detached, measurements, descriptions, comparisons. But the recent entries, they were different. Less certain, more searching, more unsettled, because what he had expected to observe was no longer what he was encountering. The summons came again that evening. Abigail entered the study as she always did, calm, measured, aware. But something felt different, not in the room, in him. Jonathan Carter did not greet her immediately. He stood by the window, looking out toward the fields, hands behind his back. For a moment, he did not turn. "You may sit," he said at last. Abigail sat. The chair creaked softly beneath her weight. Carter remained still. Then finally, he spoke. "When I first brought you here," he said slowly, "my interest was straightforward." Abigail did not respond. He turned. "I believed I had found something rare, A small pause. Something to study, to document, to understand. He walked back toward the desk, but did not sit. "And now?" Abigail asked quietly. Carter stopped. The question lingered longer than expected. "Now," he said, "I am no longer certain what I am studying." That admission was not small. For a man like Carter, certainty had always been control, and control had always been the foundation of everything. Abigail watched him carefully. "Perhaps," she said, "you are not meant to understand everything." Carter gave a faint, almost humorless smile. "That is not a position I am accustomed to accepting." "No," Abigail replied, "it is not." Something passed between them then. Not equal, never equal, but no longer simple. Carter sat down at last, opening the journal, but he did not begin writing. Instead, he looked at her. Not at her body, not at her posture, at her. "You answer questions differently than others," he said. Abigail tilted her head slightly. "Others are asked different questions." Carter exhaled slowly. "That may be true." Another pause. Then, something shifted again. "You understand your position here," he said. It was not a question. Abigail's voice remained calm. "I understand that I have no control over it." Carter nodded. "Yes." He tapped his fingers lightly against the desk. "And yet, you speak as if you do." A longer pause. Abigail met his gaze. "I control how I think," she said, "and how I answer." Carter leaned back. That answer did not challenge his authority, but it did something else. It existed outside of it, and that was unfamiliar. "Most people," he said slowly, "do not separate those things." "Most people are not given reason to," Abigail replied. Carter watched her for several seconds. Then, quietly, "You are unlike anyone I have encountered." Abigail did not react immediately. "That is not always a safe position to be in," she said. The words were soft, but their meaning was not. Carter looked down at the journal, then closed it, deliberately. For the first time since this began, he chose not to write. "That will be all for tonight," he said, but his voice lacked finality. Abigail stood, walked toward the door, then stopped. Not because she was told to, because she chose to. "You are no longer observing me," she said quietly. Carter did not answer at once. "No," he admitted. Abigail's voice remained steady. "You are trying to decide what I am." A longer pause. "And that is something you cannot measure." She stepped outside. The door closed behind her, and for a moment, Jonathan Carter remained completely still. Not thinking, not writing, just still. Because something had happened. Not visible, not dramatic, but irreversible. He walked slowly back to the desk, opened the journal again, flipped through the pages, measurement after measurement, observation after observation, all of it suddenly incomplete. He turned to a blank page, dipped the pen, paused, and for the first time did not know what to write. Outside, the plantation continued as it always had. Workers returned to their cabins, voices low, movements tired, the system intact, unchanged. But inside that house, something had begun to fracture. Not the structure, not the authority, but the certainty behind it. Back in the quarters, Ruth sat waiting again. She did not ask immediately. She never did. Abigail sat beside her. "He spoke differently tonight," Abigail said. Ruth nodded slowly. "Yes." "You felt it too?" "I have seen it before," Ruth replied. "Not often, but enough. Abigail turned slightly. What happens? Ruth's voice lowered. When a man like him stops seeing someone as a thing, he begins wanting to define them. And when he cannot, he tries to own them in other ways. Abigail looked toward the house, its window still glowing faintly in the distance. He is changing, she said. Ruth's expression hardened slightly. That is what worries me. Inside the study, Jonathan Carter sat alone, long after midnight. The candles burned low, the room filled with shadows, and the journal lay open, untouched. For weeks, he had believed he was in control of this process, that he was gathering knowledge, organizing it, mastering it. But now, he was facing something that did not behave like knowledge. It did not settle. It did not resolve. It expanded. It questioned. It resisted. And most unsettling of all, it changed him. The line had been crossed, quietly, without force, without violence, but completely. What had begun as curiosity had become attention. Attention had become fascination. And fascination was no longer holding its shape. It was turning into something else, something more personal, something less controllable. Jonathan Carter stared at the blank page in front of him and realized, for the first time in his life, he was no longer studying something he could explain. He was standing at the edge of something that might explain him, and that was far more dangerous. By the time autumn settled over the Carter plantation, the fields had begun to empty. The cotton was harvested, the wagons were loaded, and the long season of labor was coming to its quiet end. From a distance, it looked like completion, like order, like everything had unfolded exactly as it always did. But inside that stillness, something had already changed. Not in the fields, not in the system, but in the mind of the man who believed he controlled it. Jonathan Carter no longer worked as he once had. The overseer noticed it first. The inspections grew shorter, the instructions less precise, the questions unfocused. Carter still walked the plantation, but his eyes no longer followed the rows of cotton. They searched for one figure, always the same one, Abigail. And by now, everyone knew it. No one said it aloud, but silence on a plantation was never empty. It was filled with understanding. Abigail continued her routine, the fields, the work, the quiet endurance. Nothing about her movements changed, nothing about her voice, nothing about her composure, but inside, she understood something clearly now. This was no longer about curiosity. It had moved beyond that. And what came after curiosity was rarely safe. The final summons came without warning, not at sunset, not at night, but in the fading light of late afternoon. The overseer did not explain. He never did. The master wants you. Abigail nodded. She walked. The same path, the same steps. But something in the air felt different, heavier, quieter. Inside the study, Jonathan Carter was not standing, not pacing, not writing. He was sitting still. The journal closed, the instruments untouched, the room unusually quiet. "Sit," he said. Abigail sat, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then finally, "I have come to a conclusion," he said. His voice was calm, but not certain. That difference mattered. Abigail waited. "You are not what I believed you to be." A pause. "And what did you believe I was?" she asked. Carter looked at her. "For weeks, I believed you were something to be understood." He exhaled slowly. "Something to be defined." "And now?" Abigail asked. Carter hesitated, and that hesitation was everything. "Now," he said quietly, "I believe you are something that cannot be contained by definition." Abigail studied him. "That realization changes nothing about my life," she said. Carter nodded. Yes. It was the first honest answer he had given, without framing it, without softening it, without controlling it. For the first time, he understood something clearly. Understanding did not equal power, and knowledge did not grant ownership. But that understanding came too late to undo what had already begun. "I could write everything I have learned," Carter said slowly. "Every observation, every detail." He looked at the journal, and it would still not explain you. Abigail's voice remained steady. "That is because I am not something to be explained." Carter gave a faint, tired smile. "No," he said, "you are not." Another silence, different now. Not tense, not curious, just real. Then Carter asked something unexpected. "What do you think I was trying to do?" Abigail answered without hesitation. "You were trying to make sense of something that made you uncomfortable." Carter absorbed that. "And now?" "You are learning that not everything exists to make you comfortable." Carter leaned back in his chair. For months, he had searched for answers in books, in measurements, in classification, but the answer had never been in any of those things. It had been sitting in front of him, speaking, thinking, refusing to become what he expected. "You may go," he said finally. But this time, it was different. Not a dismissal, not an order, just an ending. Abigail stood, walked to the door, then paused. Not out of fear, not out of obligation, but with intention. "One day," she said quietly, "people will understand that difference is not something to control." Carter looked at her. "I hope so," he replied. But his voice carried something new. Not certainty, not authority, just distance. Abigail stepped outside. The evening air was cool. The plantation stretched out in silence. And for the first time, she felt something subtle shift. Not freedom, not safety, but clarity. Back inside, Jonathan Carter did not move. The journal remained closed, the instruments untouched, the room unchanged. And yet, everything was different. Because the thing he had believed he possessed had never belonged to him. Not her body, not her mind, not her identity. Nothing. And now, he had to live with that. In the months that followed, life on the plantation continued, as it always did. The system remained. The hierarchy remained. The control remained. Nothing collapsed. Nothing broke. Because systems like that do not break easily. But something inside Carter never returned to what it had been. He wrote less, spoke less, studied less. Because once a man sees the limits of his control, it becomes harder to pretend they do not exist. The journal remained, filled with observations, measurements, notes, but no conclusion. No final explanation. Just a record of a man who believed he could define something and discovered he could not. And Abigail? She remained, working, living, enduring, he expected, never fitting into the categories he tried to build, never surrendering the one thing he could not take from her, her understanding of herself. This story is not about a mystery of the body. It is about the limits of power, about what happens when control meets something it cannot reshape, about the quiet truth that even in the most controlled systems, there are things that remain unowned, unmeasured, unbroken. And sometimes, those are the most dangerous things of all, not because they resist loudly, but because they refuse to become anything other than what they are.